All right. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name's Joseph Beringhouse, and I'll be your host or referee, depending on how today goes. We're going to dive into the 2025 state of cloud remediation, which we are not sharing yet. Thank you, team. Boom. We're diving into the 2025 State of Cloud Remediation. My name is Joseph Beringhouse. Again, I'll be your host. If you haven't gotten a chance to review the report yet, myself or my colleague will drop it in the chat for everyone to see. Why I love these types of reports is because it really lets you dive into benchmark data. Some of you are going to see you are going to be way better than you thought you were. Some you're going to be way worse, and some you're not going to know. And to that, I have to say, no matter what, Tam Noon's here to help. So I won't make a ton of pitches about Tam Noon throughout, I promise. But Tamnoon is a managed cloud security service that sits on top of whatever your favorite CNAPP may be, wherever it may be. And between our mix of cloud expertise and our technology, we prioritize, triage, and remediate all of those pesky little CNAPP alerts in your cloud that we're going to talk about today. I promise only time I'm going to do a major pitch for Tamnoon. And it's because I'm joined by some really amazing folks with a lot of different background and perspective. And we're going to make sure they don't passionately disagree too much, which is just a nice way of saying fight a little bit. So we're going to go through this report. We're going to dive into little pieces of it and take away what a security practitioner should learn from it, why you should care about different pieces of it. And with that, I'm met by Neil Carpenter, who's here today. Neil, wave, say hi. Neil is the field CTO for Orca Security. He's our resident CNAPP expert here. Neil has a background in incident response, everything from on-prem to cloud security. And now he helps Orca's customers and future customers figure out how to do what they need to do in the cloud. James Berthotti, my buddy from a few years ago, runs a company called Latio Tech now. He was a security engineer at a number of companies working in the cloud every single day with all of the people we're talking about and seeing firsthand the problems we're talking about. And then he decided, let's go talk about vendors and what they're doing good and what they're doing bad, and helping advise other security leaders on what they should choose or shouldn't choose. Last but not least, Michael St. Ange, our head of technical services here at Tamnoon, a good buddy of mine now as well, and runs with our customers in multiple CNAPPs every single day of the week, things that are working, things that aren't working, and making sure we get our customers to a more secure place in their cloud. Say hi, Michael. Thank you. We're going to dive very quickly into the data because I want to make sure that the team here gets a chance to talk. The first and foremost piece here on the left, the state of cloud remediation is based on actual cloud data before Tamnoon users or before Tamnoon ever helped do remediation. That's an important point because we are really good at remediation. What we're going to talk about is not so great. And so we want to call that out here as well. We analyzed 7 different CNAPPs, alerts from 7 different CNAPPs, 4.76 million alerts, and brought that into about 1,800 or so unique categories. We broke them up into 2 major data sets. Those 2 data sets that we looked at are going to be all the open alerts and all the closed alerts during this last period that we analyze this data from. And then we divided that into other data sets as well. So a full point of view, as many alerts as possible, all 4.76 million alerts, and then a real point of view, which is about the top 35 or so categories. And those top 35 categories made up close to 90% of the data. So you'll see a link in the chat here momentarily to the report. If you want to get into all the methodology, you certainly can. And before we dive way too deep into the methodology as well, again, just go read the report, scroll to the very bottom if you want to get into all the methodology. I've been asked this a few times. I know, Neil, we've talked about this too. Can I just see all the data? The answer is no. We want to make sure that, one, we protect the guilty or the innocent, depending on how you view them, but also just there's a lot of data there that we want to keep safe and secure. So that's not going to be there, but you can go read everything we did as to why the data was split up in the ways we did at the bottom of the methodology. There's 2 final pieces I want to call out. An alert is any notification generated by the CNAPP or CSPM indicating a potential misconfiguration in a cloud environment. Misconfiguration is also very specifically used here. Misconfiguration is a security issue caused by an incorrect setting or configuration of cloud assets. That could be a vulnerability. It could be an identity issue. It could be a misconfiguration in the other sense of misconfiguration of your team misconfigured an asset inappropriately. Any of those scenarios is what would be considered a misconfiguration here. We picked that terminology on purpose. With that, we're going to dive into the actual first takeaway. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Joseph. Great introduction. So one of the first things that we noticed that was very, very interesting is you can have the same misconfiguration identified at wildly different severity levels depending on the CNAPP. Uh, and you can see here we got some implements, comprehensive monitoring for configuration changes, everywhere from informational all the way up to high. Same thing with rotation of keys, EC2 launch templates. Um, you know, you work for a CNAPP. Help us understand, how does this happen?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a couple of things. Right off, I would say from my point of view, we have a research team who goes through all of these alerts and sets a base score for us, right? So they say this is how bad this is, this is how bad this is. There's certainly a degree of subjectivity. That's the word I'm looking for to that. But we do everything we can to say here's how bad this could potentially be. Now, I think the other thing that has to happen on top of this, though, and where some of this difference is it requires context. Each of these things can be bad, but they're not necessarily bad. It depends on where they are. And I'm going to take like security groups should not allow unrestricted access to ports with high risk. If it's a machine that's part of a production application, it has access to sensitive data, it has sensitive users or admin users present. It's maybe part of attack paths that would get an attacker to something interesting. This certainly increases the risk. I'm not sure that this would typically reach critical in my own assessment, but if it's an asset that's none of those things, if it's a machine a developer spun up that has no access to anything, is all on its own, not exposed to the outside, maybe this is not that interesting. So I think that there's an argument that there is there's a spread in how you assess these, depending on the context and the situation.
Yeah, I think one of the key problems with all of these severities is if you're like me, you probably part of why you bought a CNAPP was learning the cloud in the first place and trying to understand what is a misconfiguration and like how should a cloud environment be properly configured or not. And really the answer to all of these questions is I have to talk to a developer about why the settings for this instance are the way they are, except for like outbound traffic to a malicious IP, which even that can sometimes be like when I was working at an MDR, we sometimes did this as part of our checking. And so even that was not a real misconfiguration or not. And I think that gets at the context point, but I'll just drive the point that it's really hard for a tool by itself to even do a lot of this because it involves conversations with people and trying to assume context that's both organizational and technical. And a lot of times the tool can do its best to get the technical context of saying like, hey, this is an exploitable thing, looking at a combination of the environment. But fundamentally, each one of these alerts is going to require a conversation with the person who configured the environment that way. And I think that's what really slows things down across the board.
Yeah, from the pointy end of the spear, I'll add on to this. Having 5 severity ratings makes prioritization very, very difficult. And you're going to find that's a theme throughout the data in this report. I'll say from the CNAPP perspective, we super appreciate, those of us who use these things on a daily basis to help prioritize and remediate. We appreciate the CNAPPs that are taking in as much context as they can in helping to identify what's the correct severity rating for this misconfiguration on this asset. And I think that's really what we're talking about here is these aren't actually apples to apples comparisons. Usually when we see these variations, it is because the CNAPP is trying to take in that additional context. Where this can go wildly wrong is, for example, we have a customer, their production environment is labeled non-production and their non-production environment is labeled production. Perhaps that's security through obscurity. I know for a fact it's not. It just so happens something was broken in production and they got non-prod to work and off they went and we never went back. But when that happens, the CNAPP is going to take that context in and say, oh, cool, this is a non-production environment. It should be prioritized less or have a lesser severity rating than something that's labeled production. And so sometimes that can go wrong. The other place this goes wrong is folks have non-production environments that have access to production data. In that case, I would argue the distinction is probably less meaningful. But again, probably pretty difficult to gather that context from the CNAPPs perspective. Neil, James, anything else to add to that?
I think I think of several vendors that have tried to make, there's been a lot of attempts to try to fix this when it's like, usually ultimately what vendors try to do is lower the amount of criticals that they flag, or just generally lower the severity in general. And I think that just creates a different issue that it doesn't solve the fundamental problem, which in my mind is, we've spent too much time on identifying issues and not enough time on figuring out like how do we actually fix these things, and make the results something that's actually usable to a DevOps team, to a cloud engineering team, instead of a list of things that try to indicate how loud we should yell at those teams about it for.
Yeah, and for those of you who are old enough to remember reading novels that had actual plots, a bit of foreshadowing, I think, James, as to what's to come. Joseph, I think we are ready to go to the next slide. Perfect. Yep. And so, yeah, in this case, S3 bucket, it's left open to the public. What this means is any unauthenticated user can make a web call to the bucket and retrieve an object. It's usually what we mean when we say public. We usually say this is a high risk because it's just open to the internet. But sometimes we see CNAPPs marking it down if it doesn't contain sensitive data or other things like that. Again, kind of interesting, but it is limited. How much do you trust that the categorization of the data is correct? Jury's out for me.
Yeah, I mean, I recently published the first like Latio report, which I guess is a plug for that on like SAST auto fixing. And because I have access to a lot of CNAPPs for testing. And in a lot of those CNAPPs, I got an alert saying, this admin user created a public S3 bucket. And it's like, yeah, that was because I was publishing a PDF that I wanted to be publicly accessible for it. And I think the way that breaks is just at scale when you've got a lot of different engineering efforts trying to do different work. And the security team ends up sort of just endlessly like making themselves look bad, but also frustrating developers and creating inefficiencies because all they can do is say, hey, you did this, was this intentional or not? And I don't know, I just never viewed that as incredibly impactful security, like slacking developers to say, hey, was this on purpose? Yeah.
Sure.
And James, you bring up what I think is one of the primary jobs of a CNAPP that we don't talk about much. And that's translating for security people, ultimately. I feel like a lot of security teams know security very well and have a very tenuous grasp on cloud. And so we spend a lot of time saying, how can we make this more obvious? How can we fill in the gaps that security teams have about the cloud, especially when we're multi-cloud, right? Because not only is it different when I move to AWS, it's different terms and different concepts in AWS, Azure, Google, et cetera. So, one of the things I think is for me a mark of a successful CNAPP is not just sort of generating the right alerts and prioritizing them right and everything else. It's giving security teams enough clues and context that they sound a little bit smarter than they might have otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's definitely fundamentally the goal. And I think that's why so many people are pushing into the code to cloud thing, because ultimately that's, if I go to a DevOps person and say, hey, this bucket was made public, what happened? As opposed to, oh, this developer made a Terraform change to make this bucket public, and it's in this repo that's called report sharing that is like obviously used for sharing public reports. Like the more of that contextual developer workflow is the secret to making this stuff properly. Say, hey, this bucket was made. I feel like we're all paused. I heard
I
myself.
was gonna
burp.
say, did I lose audio?
No, we're good. You keep going.
Okay.
We're good.
All right. All right. Well, here we are. 10 years into cloud security, and we're still wildly exposed. So what you're looking at here is the mean time to resolution averaged out by CNAPP severity. Honestly, these numbers don't surprise me much. When I look at the organization and the culture of, let me just say, like, enterprises that don't do technology as a core part of what they do. I won't name some names, but there are some technology companies out there that do an exceptional job with this because it's how they were born. It's integrated into their DNA. They're just very, very good at it. For the rest of the enterprise, you got to do what you got to do. And the problem really here is that detection doesn't make it back to the people who need to fix it. It takes so long. In this case, I've seen this a bunch of times where CNAPP is producing these alerts. The alerts go into a dashboard. Someone might generate a report that gets emailed out. It goes to a security engineer who presents to a security leadership meeting, and then it goes up 3 levels of executive management to come back across and back down. And it takes forever. And in fact, if you could flip ahead one chart, I'll even steal my own thunder a little bit. 21 days to engage. 21 days to engage. That is forever. That is forever. It took 21 days to tell the person who made the mistake, who made the misconfiguration, that they did something wrong. That's insane. It actually goes back to in one of my previous roles when I was working for a very large cloud provider whose name rhymes with SHMAWS. We dived deep on the DevSecOps program where we thought about how do we get security folks involved in developer life? How do you develop code? How do you deploy code? What opportunities are there to take that cycle that takes so long and just condense it and bring it down? But I'm not here to make a DevSecOps pitch. I guess the last thing I really say, and this is again a theme through this whole report, is when everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. And so when you have these alerts stacking up, it just becomes difficult to understand where to engage. James, start.
Michael,
oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No.
So I was going to say, you said you weren't surprised by these numbers. I think my first reaction was that I was surprised in the sense that I don't think anybody really focuses on fixing low and informational and maybe even medium. So to see low and informational being fixed faster, the only thing I can think is those are accidentally resolved. Those are from resources that are being decommissioned. Somebody did something that just magically resolved those alerts, but not intentionally, right? I think ultimately there's a line of intention here that's really critical and high, and stuff under that gets solved much more accidentally.
Yet, I mean, to me, I think a CISO would want this to look like their critical is super low, and then you see like an escalating up of the amount of time it takes. But I think really what this is revealing is related to the last slide of the misalignment on prioritization and criticality, because fundamentally, I think the issue is that criticality has nothing to do with the fix process. And so things sort of get fixed in whatever order things happen, because the way things actually get prioritized is like, oh, I know how to fix that. Oh, that's an easy fix. Oh, I can talk to the DevOps guy that I have a friendship with who manages that account and he can fix this stuff for me. Like there's a lot more organizational pull around how we remediate these things. And I think that's why these are just sort of all over the place, but all, in the long time period. I think what we need to get better about doing is instead of prioritizing based on the criticality of the misconfiguration, creating remediation campaigns around similar types of findings. So instead of, if we take that S3 bucket example from earlier, instead of turning that into, say we've got 30 public S3 buckets, instead of creating 30 different tickets for 30 different DevOps teams, which is sort of like you're thinking the right way in terms of DevSecOps. But from an organizational perspective, the right thing to do would be to take all of those public S3 buckets, condense them into one ticket, and in one sprint, have a DevOps person, cloud engineer, security engineer, whoever is able to actually fix those things, spend that sprint investigating why are these S3 buckets public? Can we get them closed? And then instead, you might be able to those alerts based on if they have PII or not PII or public, like what's the attack path, what's the toxic combination. Like really what matters more than that is you'll be able to remediate and have institutional knowledge at that point of here's when we have public S3 buckets, here's why we have them or why we don't, and we've fixed them across the enterprise instead of being guided by the criticality alone.
But whack-a-mole, such a fun game, James.
That's right.
And then, James, I would say as sort of the post-mortem, the coming out of that sprint, it's important that you go back and fix how alerts are being generated. Do something like say, hey, you know what? We are going to proactively tag buckets if we expect them to have public data, to be publicly accessible, so that we can exclude them from alerts and reduce the number of alerts we're generating to begin with.
And that's, by the way, I think this applies even more on the ASPM side, which I know we're not really talking about. But like even there, the code fixes get to another layer of complication where you're creating like custom sanitizers and custom code fixes. But it's the same thing in theory, where instead of going on these criticalities, it's let's take one fix that we're going to apply, figure out how as an organization we want to tackle this issue, and then go and apply it at scale, as opposed to treating these as like one-off incidents.
Yeah, I'll add, I think there's a couple patterns, I should say anecdotes. I don't know that I have enough data to call it a pattern. One pattern that I have observed is when you get the security champion in a dev team and they want to be impactful, oftentimes when you get into these highs and criticals, they're very complex issues. They require a lot of testing, and they might require a lot of different stakeholders. For example, if we're making massive networking changes to the way that the VPC is configured, odds are the developer doesn't have the authority, the experience, the know-how, and hopefully the permissions in that case to make those changes on their own. But the lows are often within the realm of they don't need to ask anybody. There is simple change to make, simple change to test. And so when you have people that want to be proactive, I think low and informational sort of tends to be the place where they can make the most impact without running into the machine, so to speak. And then again, going to the complexity, when we get to critical alerts, they're generally very complex issues, and they're very complex to undo. And those take more time to solve. But I agree with you, Neil. It is interesting to see lows and informationals. And I don't think you're wrong when you say they're getting fixed by accident. Fixing the critical, fix the low, so to speak. Okay, have we beat this? Well, we could talk a little bit about the timeline here, and this goes back to what I was saying about the detection takes so long to make it back to the person that needs to fix it. And so if we take even a moderately complex change that involves multiple stakeholders, first off, that 21 days, that is just tragic. But then it takes 42 days, that triage, that impact analysis. So getting back to what you said, Neil, context, that context matters. What are we really looking at here? What is the problem? I love the idea about cutting across the organization and asking the question, okay, if this is a problem once, where else is this a problem? And should we look at attacking this sort of proactively? Well, actually, it is reactively, but tackling it systemically. Let's look at this problem across the entire organization and figure out how we fix it. But it's going to get the triage, getting the impact analysis, doing the log dives, which developers may or may not have access to. Same for security engineers. If you need a combination of security logs and application logs, that can take time. And then approvals and remediation, can take forever as well. Yeah, James, Neil, what's your take on this?
Yeah, it takes a long time. It's
James,
I think,
why does it take so long, James? Walk me through that, will you?
Well, I remember at one of the first companies where we got a CNAPP, I had to schedule like a daily morning meeting to review the new misconfiguration findings that were coming in, because it was maybe like 3 to 10 misconfiguration findings a day, just from like normal cloud engineering activity. And so the time to engage really is high because there's so many false positives in there that we didn't want to send them directly to development teams. And so they have to have some kind of review, which requires a lot of that high level planning of, okay, how are we going to surface these to developers in a way that makes sense? And then once you finally get that, you're going to get a lot of pushback from the product organization if they're frankly doing their job well. Like they're not going to want to just, oh, security put a ticket on our board. Let's go fix it immediately. What's the, like, you're going to have to justify the work that has to get done as part of the triage process. And then when you finally get the work going on it, there's obviously a lot of unknown unknowns. And so I can just use a simple example was, there was a company I was at where we thought we were encrypting our EBS volumes, and oops, we weren't. And so like that is a massive pain to go fix, because you have to spin up new volumes, transfer all the data over, like connect the new ones, and then decommission the old ones. And so I mean that is in theory coming into the way it came into our CNAPP was as like 40 alerts, one for each EBS volume. It took a lot of time to figure out, what are we going to do with this? Who's the right person to fix it? How do we talk about getting it fixed? How do we have to talk to the compliance team about the organizational impact of it? Like, do we actually have to encrypt this or not? Because that's its own cloud security debate. So there's all these debates and stakeholders that happen. Even for something that, like, I think unencrypted EBS is like a medium or a low most of the time, because encryption in the cloud is a weird thing. But all that to say, it just takes forever because these are tough engineering problems with major impacts. Like if the product team decided we need to provide as a feature to our customers the ability to encrypt their data, that would be a big product Q, like quarter deliverable for them. And it's no different when it's security that's asking for it.
I remember this was in a professional services engagement in a previous life. We had a customer and they were just obsessed about pushing back on AWS EBS, Elastic Block Store volume encryption. And there was the debate about performance and cost and this and that, and they went back and forth and the complexities. I interrupted the meeting, a bunch of executives interrupted the meeting, and I shared my screen and I showed them, we're talking about a checkbox. Like there's so little decision making. And so what we were actually discussing, no performance issues, $1 per month per KMS key, if that's still the same as it was. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong there, but like we're talking about a checkbox. I think we're perhaps overcomplicating this decision. Did you ever see that?
Oh yeah, I mean it was exactly the same, because we were doing a lot of high volume IO work, and so there was when you bring everything into architectural review, it's going to get scrutinized as a high business impact thing. And that's why, fundamentally, that's why I don't think misconfiguration alerts should get treated the same as runtime incidents, because they are large engineering efforts. They're not CrowdStrike quarantined a PDF file on the accountant's computer. Like these are big engineering decisions that have to get made.
Sure. I think we probably covered something similar to this, Joseph, if you want to move on to the next takeaway. So this is another one that I think we were surprised, but then not surprised. And again, there's a bunch of sayings I like to say over and over again. One of them is, if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. And so I would like to think that people who make detection tools probably think about that in terms of, well, if I make everything critical, how is someone supposed to differentiate the one critical from another critical? And so I'd love to believe that somewhere in the back rooms where these decisions are getting made, they're thinking about, well, we want to make sure that critical represents just that cream of the top of these are the most important things that you should be thinking about, absent all other contexts that the CNAPP is evaluating. Neil, bring us into that back room. How are these decisions made?
Yeah, I mean, no doubt we are thinking about that a lot. I was talking to a CISO who described it as telling his team the 10 things they need to focus on today, which is boiling it down quite a bit. Now, for Orca, I would say this is more like a straight line, right? Typically, our criticals are the most rare, highs are the next most rare, medium, low, informational. There's not this huge spike at high for us in everything I've seen. But generally speaking, it's a balance of wanting to put the right things in front of users to make sure that they're focusing where we think there's the biggest impact from a security perspective. And I'm going to differentiate from remediation effort, because that is a separate question, a separate problem to solve for. But we're trying to say, here is the, let's just say 1% of things across the 100,000 issues in your entire environment that you've got to focus on today, you've got to be thinking about, you've got to be responding to. And here's the 2, 3, 4, 5% that you've got to be focusing on this week. And then here's a bunch of stuff that, is more normal cycle. And here's a bunch of stuff, if you're really bored, you might want to get to, but they're not going to impact significantly the security, availability, integrity, confidentiality, sort of all of that stuff of your environment. So absolutely, from a researcher perspective, we are thinking about how do we put the most important things in front of you first, and then from there provide more reasonable buckets that are larger moving from there.
So James, you work with a lot of tools and a lot of customers. How does this help? How does this not help?
Yeah, I think I was just thinking about how I think the balance that a lot of security vendors have to walk is like when you're looking at buying a CNAPP, you're almost a little disappointed if there's no critical findings, because like you're wanting to justify this tool to show you like these glaring holes in your environment where an attacker could take over or whatever. And so a lot of vendors like honestly have this way to like sometimes it's in the product, sometimes it's not, whatever. But like when they're getting assessed, they want to turn up the detection logic a little bit so that things look a little more on fire, so that the CISO can buy the tool, whatever. And then in real life, they want to like dial it down a little bit to give you the more realistic what you're going to get done phase. And I think this just speaks to that the core issues we've been talking about, where again, I always advocate for separating posture alerts from runtime detections for this very reason, where the posture stuff, like it's a critical risk, meaning it could be exploited. It is not the same thing as a critical runtime alert saying you are getting exploited right now. And I think that's the fundamental issue when it comes to like even prioritizing a critical. If I have a critical misconfiguration, I could let it sit. Like maybe it'll get exploited or not. Obviously, you should fix it, but it's a different prioritization challenge than an operations one where you need to fix it immediately because you're actively getting your data exfiltrated.
All right, so we promised Joseph at least one brawl. CDR is beginning to blend these lines between misconfiguration and incident response. Bite, discuss.
I mean, I think it's bad. I think it's the fundamental flaw that certain CNAPP vendors have taken, where they started combining these alerts together as if they're the same thing. I think the two certainly inform each other. Like a SOC analyst wants to know, hey, if a container escape's happening, here's what credentials live on this container and what it could access. But just I'm talking purely like the death knell to me of any CNAPP solution is when I click the incidents tab and I see a combination of like public S3 bucket with container escape. It's like those are radically different levels of priority. And they have to be clearly delineated. I'm fine with them both being in the same product. I don't think I know every CNAPP vendor wants to say like, oh, look at like, obviously there's benefit because we have all the cloud context and now here's this runtime context. I don't think there's actually that much crossover. But I'm fine with it as long as the user experience is fundamentally different between those capabilities.
And I think that we have all this cloud context, and then we have all this runtime context, and it's incredibly valuable. No, I'm sorry. There is, I will say, there is benefit there, right? And I'm coming at it as a former incident responder. For me, when I look at, and by the way, I typically use the words risks and threats. Risks are a misconfiguration of vulnerability that might get me compromised. A threat is an indicator that I may be compromised now. And so, sort of however you split those apart, that is important. But, I will say as an incident responder, when I start looking at a threat, when I look at here's a piece of malware, here's a connection to a malicious IP, whatever that indicator is, one of the important things to me is all of the context and the ability to go, oh, okay, this machine has sensitive data, this machine's exposed to the outside world, it has this vulnerability, which has this known exploit, which gets me here. Sort of all of that helps me triage and start responding and going from there. There's a lot of value to being able to swim across those two sides of it. It is important that it is clearly delineated sort of who the audience is for that. And I would agree, if you start showing me an incident view and you're showing me S3 buckets that are public, you've crossed the streams in a way that's not very valuable. But if you can show me that, you know, critical data was accessed, and then I can see sort of back from there all the context, that gets much more interesting.
Well, that's all real quick, because I have to complain about it. I think what Neil just said is definitely how I've thought about it as far as risk versus threat. But I think that the whole CTEM category is what is blowing up. The people are using the term threat now, and I just posted about this like 2 weeks ago or whatever. Like, threat means whatever people want it to mean. It's like any bad thing that could happen now. Because a lot of CTEM platforms are really vulnerability management, misconfiguration management tools, but they want to make it sound like, oh, but we handle really bad vulnerabilities and those are threats. And it's like, no, like, let's please keep this focused where like you are either getting exploited or you could be exploited. And so that's why I've tried to switch to that language as opposed to threat, just because like all good things, there's acronyms ruining how we talk about stuff.
We're in violent agreement on this one.
Cool.
Yeah, and I'll tack on to this, you know, or I recently had a personal experience where friends, you know, they have a CNAPP. CNAPP has some, I'll call it behavioral based alerts set up in there. And the trouble was the CNAPP is monitored by cloud platform team, not at the incident response team. And so there was this, because of the way the CNAPP presented the problem, they presented it like it was a misconfiguration that needed to be addressed at high priority, instead of going, no, you are under attack. Someone is trying to break in. They may have already, and you haven't done the due diligence to learn whether that's occurred yet or not. It's sort of, you're engaging the wrong stakeholder, asking the wrong questions, and driving the wrong behavior. And so if you're a CISO out there listening to this, please pay attention. Your folks might not be doing what you think you want them to do. Okay, yeah, back to what we were supposed to talk about with this slide. Thank you for the CDR discussion, though. That was delicious. So because we're only classifying so many of these alerts as critical, there's a lot hiding in the highs, and even in the mediums sometimes. And we've got two examples here that I think are very interesting. And again, I have a somewhat interesting perspective on these things. But the first is the instance metadata service, version 1 to version 2. Some of you may have heard about a very public attack that was successful some years ago, about 7 years ago, if memory serves, where an SSRF attack was used to exploit a vulnerable EC2 instance. The threat actor was able to use that SSRF attack to generate a web request to the instance metadata service, retrieve the credentials for that EC2. And then because that EC2 had an overprivileged role, it was able, the threat actor was able to take those credentials and exfiltrate data from S3 because of it. And so this is still a very valid thing. These attacks still occur in the wild today, and they happen all the time. You know, to the point we just had, is it critical? I don't know. You know, again, it sort of probably depends on your environment and what's behind and what other protections you have in place. Again, context. But what I will say is this is still a very exploitable vulnerability. And so when you do see that combination of misconfigurations or attack path, all of a sudden this instance metadata service, I would argue, isn't a high. Although, to be honest, I steer clear of the severity conversation and I just say, look, we have an attack path. This is the easiest way to disrupt this attack path. So let's do this. Curious, any experiences with instance metadata service from either of you? Any anecdotes you'd like to share?
I mean, just that it's scary. Like it's scary to fix. I mean, like that's the fundamental issue with all of these is that anytime a security person who's not in the weeds of cloud engineering every day is suggesting like something that feels like it's going to be a major fix, or they don't totally understand, like that's what's going to slow down the remediation process. And then to your point around attack paths, I've seen some CNAPPs try to experiment, like, because the golden ticket, which is weird, I don't know, is the golden ticket for all of this stuff to get to the chocolate factory is that you can recreate an attack from the outside for any of these things. And I think this is a good example of why that methodology just sort of like falls a little flat in my view, because there's a lot of tools out there that'll do like, oh, we do like a curl or like a DAS scan basically against a public endpoint so that you know what's exploitable or not. It's like, okay, are you like recreating an attack path all the way down to getting a shell on an EC2 instance and running a curl, or like recreating these instant metadata? Like it's all very custom sort of attacks when the exploit happens. And so there's no like easy solution here. Yeah.
So I tend to think a little bit of this. In medicine, they talk about acute problems and chronic problems, right? Things you're going to die if you don't address them today, and things that are going to affect you for a long time. When we think about alert classification, that's sort of my thinking is critical and high alerts should really be acute. They should be things that need my attention right now, versus things that are long drawn out, require sort of ongoing maintenance. To me, the instance metadata issue is much more of a chronic problem, right? Like it's not, if this comes up on a machine today, it's not critical. I'm not even sure that it's high. It's got to be addressed today or this week. Although those are obviously unreasonable numbers based on earlier slides, but it's not something I should think about addressing today or this week. It's something I've got to think more holistically about. How do I fix this? Do I need to go back to my Terraform sort of library that's being used to generate everything that's deploying everything, and make sure that I'm turning this on there, and from now on, every time somebody creates new Terraform code to deploy new machines, that they're going to do it in what's the right way and be in a good shape. Like it's not, to me, this is not a high severity alert typically.
Interesting.
I think it's where it requires like a very attacker oriented view of your infrastructure to even be able to prioritize that way or not. Because it requires some sort of ability to interact with the box itself to query the service, unless your application's really funky and you're just allowing it directly. And that's where, how you prioritize it's going to really differ based on like where you view it in the MITRE sort of attack flow.
Yeah, so this other one is also interesting to me because they represent sort of two ends of the spectrum. And let me explain what I mean. When we talked about the instance metadata service attack path, right? First off, the threat actor has to discover whatever the endpoint is. Either you've put your operating system on the internet, which is always a terrible idea, or they found the application endpoint. They reconned it, SSRF attack available. They execute the SSRF attack. They get the credentials. They exfiltrate the credentials. Now they got to explore what permissions they have and what data is available, and then they finally are able to exfiltrate your data. So it's a pretty reasonable attack path. Someone is putting in some effort to do that. If you have a public S3 bucket, the attack path is the threat actor accesses your data. That is it. There's nothing else they need to do. And if you don't know this, there are scanners that specifically go after and track public S3 buckets. And my understanding, I do not surf the dark web myself, but I understand they are very trivial to purchase these lists of public S3 buckets.
There's a resource called Gray Hat Warfare out there that's like just updated constantly, like within minutes. Like if I put an S3 bucket public, it's getting scanned within like 30 seconds.
Yeah. So yeah, to the point, within 30 seconds of introducing this misconfiguration, it is now internet known. You are internet famous. And all they have to do is go pull the data. There's no exploit. There's nothing else they have to do. And so I talk about these two ends of the spectrum. You know, IMDS, sure, it's an attack path. Attackers know how to do it. If your bucket's public, like, game on. Like, there is no attack path. You just put your data on the internet. I would argue you weren't even exploited. Neil, anything to add?
This is an area where I think the risk is high enough. I would want to automate this, right? Like we talked earlier about sort of building a process that says, here's how we're going to tag, label, whatever, where we have an approved exception for a public S3 bucket. I'd be totally satisfied with if somebody creates a new bucket, it's not tagged, labeled, whatever, according to our process, and it's public, we just turn it off and let that sort of, like, there's enough risk here. It's an immediate enough risk. I don't feel bad about that if we've got a process. Now that's a certain level of maturity in the organization. That's an acceptance that sometimes somebody's going to make a mistake that breaks some eggs. But I think on balance, this is a place where automated response makes sense to me, and with a minimum of sort of process can work well.
Well, that just to depending on what you mean by response, I don't know if I'm disagreeing or not, as far as like, it's why I think the CDR discussion, I like think of workloads and then cloud stuff like maybe, but on the remediation side, Joseph and I have talked about this before, where it's like, if you're not using Terraform, I think the first security finding is like, go use Terraform, because you need ways to do guardrails for this. And your only choices for preventative guardrails, if you're getting scanned in 30 seconds, you're either going to have to do it with permission policies and SCPs, or you're going to have to do it with Terraform and like custom modules and stuff. And those are your only two options. And to me, that's why I think, instead of like for misconfiguration response, we're really talking about building scalable guardrails for preventing these things from happening in the first place, and then tracking exceptions to that.
And I think that would be the Platonic ideal for it. I think unfortunately not everybody's there, and it may be finding it before it's hopefully too late instead of not responding at all. But yeah, preferably you're using IAC, you've got guardrails in place, you're catching it before it ever gets deployed.
So I do a lot of mentoring. We always complain we have a lack of talent in the cybersecurity community, and so I try to do my part to help new folks get in. And one of the things that I really hammer down on is going back to basics: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And Neil, what I just heard you say is so profound. You are making the business decision that in this case, confidentiality is more important than availability. Again, like all of the cloud complexities aside, you're saying I would rather something not be available than to violate confidentiality. And I love just kind of sometimes bringing these very complex topics back to really simple foundational concepts.
I mean, there's always a balance there, right? If it's only very, very confidential and it's massively available, maybe that's not a great decision. But I think for S3 buckets, that's the calculus.
Yeah, I agree. Joseph, next takeaway. Okay, so there's two charts that I find they're more interesting to look at them together rather than independently. But what this first one is telling us is that for alerts in the streaming category, it takes 997 days to remediate. Or if we bring that down to storage, it's more like 256 days. And you can see the breakdown therein. And when I look at these things, I think I see they're sort of in the more complex, the least understood the technology, the longer it takes to remediate. If we can flip to the next chart. But now we can see in terms of, this is the how many alerts. So 53.53% of the alerts that we examined here were compute related, and then storage and network and so on. And so you can see streaming is 0.35% of the entire population. And yet again, please flip back again. It takes 997 days. For me, this wasn't as surprising as it was to others. Trying to not use double negatives, but the less a technology is understood, the longer it takes to remediate, and the more expertise that it takes to understand what a technology does, the longer it takes to remediate. But I'm curious, James, I'll start with you. As you look at this data, what jumped out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I laughed when I read like what counts as streaming. Like, just as a reminder, it's Kinesis, MSK, and SQS, and that makes like fundamentally, if I'm at my most provocative, I'll say cloud security is really just container security, but we've like put a bunch of other stuff around it to like not have to deal with the thing we don't want to learn, how modern cloud architectures work. And all of these technologies, it's exactly what you're saying, where it's Kubernetes workloads running containers, and they use streaming services like MSK to pass things between microservices. And microservice architectures are extremely difficult. And when a CNAPP alert is saying like, hey, you have a misconfiguration in your MSK, which by the way is how all of your microservices talk to each other. I remember the first time I put a Datadog in somewhere, and I was super excited to get the graph view, and then it was just like microservices MSK. It's like, great, that's super helpful. And so yeah, I mean, it's exactly what you're saying, where in a huge distributed environment like that, there's maybe 2 people in the entire company that understand like high level how the application actually is working. And the security guy is going to come in and say like, hey, chief architect, my CNAPP tool says there's a misconfiguration with this. When can we get this resolved? Like, it's just not going to get prioritized, and it's not going to happen compared to launching, the 15 AI product launches that the board wants to get pushed out or whatever. And so it fundamentally gets to that piece where security people don't want to learn modern cloud architectures. And I think that's been a huge struggle for the industry as a whole. And CNAPPs, that's why I always go to remediation, is CNAPPs haven't really helped people learn them as much as they've helped people like figure out other stuff to do in the cloud. So
I think the counterpoint here is IAM is not an easy set of problems to solve. I always joke, if somebody tells me they understand cloud IAM, I think they're probably lying, because it's not a human scale problem anymore. I'm wondering if the number here is low because a lot of the CNAPPs do have automated tools to help outline what IAM remediation would look like. Here's a least privilege policy for this user or this role. It strikes me that otherwise I'm not sure that there's easy resolutions in that space.
Yeah, I think large scale IAM stuff is difficult to like architect correctly, but on a micro, like alert by alert, it's pretty easy to just, deny this. Okay, like go talk to the dev. Hey, do you need this? Oh no, I forgot. I forgot I even had it. Okay. Then you add the deny policy. And so it just requires like sucking it up, going through the backlog of 200 IAM alerts and going through it. But it's definitely, to your point, like building an IAM architecture in the cloud is extremely challenging to navigate.
Neil, to your point, I would actually love to know within this data, how much of these were IAM users created 8 to 10 years ago that have been unused for just as long? And that's how they get remediated in the first place. Because your point, IAM is hard. And especially because it takes very few characters to say, give me all of the permissions you have. And it takes a lot more characters to somehow narrow that down. And the difference between everything and not everything is actually very significant when you talk about cloud permissions and identity and access management, for sure. Okay, so I'm going to summarize this slide with no one wants to do the hard work. That is my theme here. Usually when I see critical, even sometimes the high severity alerts, these are hairy issues. They often involve multiple stakeholders to arrive at some sort of consensus about what the right approach to address the criticals, as opposed to a low, which is usually just a, hey, I'm flipping this bit from 0 to 1, off we go, test, make sure it's good. Criticals might involve re-architecting applications, introducing new services, finding ways to mitigate things that cannot be changed. And so I'll say this slide doesn't really surprise me at all. I know we like to say that criticals have the most attention, but I'm not sure that both of those things can't be true.
Yeah, my only thought is I wonder how much of this, I know that if something is at the top of a dashboard all the time, like I'll figure it out. And then once I figured it out, it probably just sits there forever. As far as like, either either it's a false positive and you just haven't bothered to flag it that way, or you know what the fix is going to be, but it's, to your point, super complicated, and there's already a loose plan in place. People are generally aware. And so then it just kind of sits there because the urgency has evaporated from it.
Yes, Neil, from a CNAPP perspective, how do you think about ensuring that your customers are burning down their backlog and we don't get this complacency where, well, every time I log in, there's that critical at the top of the list, and I'm so used to being it there. It being there, I'd be lonely if I didn't see it. You know, how do you think about addressing that?
Yeah, I think it's a hard problem, right? Like, let me not make light of it. You know, there's a couple of things from my point of view. I mean, first of all, we are doing everything we can to integrate with sort of the infrastructure that helps customers do this. We see much better results for customers who've built deep integrations with their ticketing systems. And so at least now it's not just Orca bothering a security analyst, it's Jira bothering everybody else as well. That's helpful. It doesn't address a lot of the other problems, but at least it's getting in front of the right people. For us, I think one of the other things that we see some companies focus on is we do have a security score all up, which is a great way of representing sort of to top tier, our senior management, the board, et cetera, broken up from a few things. And we see a couple of important things. First of all, we see that customers who buy the platform and implement it increase that year over year. So there's always some motion there. And we see the customers we have who are really good at this have very high scores there. So, you know, I think there's a certain amount of, if you have a number that you show somewhere to the top, that's going to drive better behaviors. Anything that moves that number, regardless of whether it's a security score that Orca calculates for you or your CNAPP, or it's some sort of dashboard that goes up. If those things show up on there, if they affect the way you look in front of senior management, they help prioritize it. But that's to some extent, I'm waving my hands, right? Like, ultimately, this is an organizational responsibility. I can provide you with numbers and bar charts and everything else, but the best thing I can do is make it easy for you to get the right data, get it to the right people, and have some idea of how to remediate it.
Seems legit. Okay, we are approaching our end of time. I will give each of you one opportunity to share one best practice. You know, you get to talk to this entire community. What do you want to share? What do you want everyone to know? James, we'll start with you.
Usually I say learn Kubernetes, but I feel like I already said that. But that continues to be like, stop putting it off and just learn it. Because it's how, like, you got to learn how containers work if you're going to do cloud security, because there's no avoiding it. So,
Neil?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big proponent of learning Kubernetes too. There's a cluster there, there's a cluster there. But I would say, think about the overall flow of alerts, right? Think about how you get it in front of the right person or the right people, the right teams, as early as possible. That's not the only gap that we saw in all the data we looked at, but that's an early one, I think, as you build a more mature cloud security practice to focus on.
Awesome. I am going to go down the identity and access management route. IAM is fundamental to cloud services. If you don't understand it, you will screw something up and it will be bad. Learn it. Take the time, and you're not going to read about it. Get in there, play with it, build with it, and understand truly how it works. That's my soundbite.
and then if you learn Kubernetes IAM, you can really hate your life about where things have gone.
Thank you all so much for being here. Make sure to hit James, Neil, and Michael up on LinkedIn. We actually don't have time for questions today, unfortunately, but I promise you they would love to chat in DMs. If you need to get in touch with any of them, you can reach out to me as well, or reach out to Tam Noon in the comments, and we'll make sure you get in touch with them as well. Always here to help on solving your cloud remediation problems. If you have them, don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks everyone for being here.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.